As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
We don't notice the way that we don't give boys friendship stories, the way that we normalize, these stories of aggression, the way that we don't teach them these skills, the way that we don't give them the kind of care as babies that we give to girls, and I think boys don't have that vocabulary and they don't have those critical thinking skills to call it out, and nor do adults. So I think that's the first step, the critical thinking. The second is the curiosity. I think we need to listen to boys and really listen. It's like, what is your experience?
That was Ruth Whippman on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 4 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and author of Act for Burnout, Act Daily Journal, and the Act Daily Card Deck.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and author of an upcoming book on being a better conversationalist and making friends.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hi, listeners. 2 quick notes before we get into today's episode. First, please remember we have our listener survey through November 15th, and we are so excited to hear your thoughts about what's going well and any suggestions you might have to make it better. As data scientists, we get really geeked out about this. So please take a moment to either go to the survey in the show notes, or you can find it on the website, and just click and take about 3 minutes to give us your thoughts. And then second, there's a very special episode coming up that is our first ever Experts Roundtable, where we tackle this question of what exactly is going on with technology and our youth mental health. So please check that out. Thanks. Hi, everyone. It's Emily, and I'm here with Jill to talk about what I felt like was a really thought-provoking conversation with Ruth Whippman, author of Boy Mom, Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity. So, Jill, I've been dying to talk to you about this. What did you think about this conversation?
Yes, because of the co-hosts, you and I are the only moms of boys,
yes.
Right? Well, I thought this was a great conversation that really rounded out. We did the episode with Danny Singley about men and fathers and their mental health. And I really loved how this sort of backtracked us to the beginning and talking about boyhood and the culture of masculinity and what we need to be doing to be raising healthy boys and getting away from the impossible types of standards that are set when we think about kind of stereotypical definitions of masculinity. And I think one of the points that comes out of this episode is we shouldn't really even be talking about femininity or masculinity. It's really what are the basic needs of all humans, irrespective of gender? And how can we as a society, a culture, engender that in all of our small humans as they grow, getting away from the stereotypical expectations that are set forth by gender that create a lot of issues?
And I think what I really got out of reading the book and talking to Ruth is femininity is not in the cultural discussion in any way compared to the phrase masculinity. And that was kind of a light bulb moment for me.
Right.
And
like you don't hear phrases like toxic femininity or healthy femininity. Yeah. It's like just not even a thing. Right.
Right. And I think what I really got out of this, especially as a woman and a feminist woman raising a son in this day and age, is how these standards or stereotypes or norms that are part of masculinity are actually failing everyone.
Right.
They're failing our boys, our men, and our girls and our women. It's
they're bad for
everyone. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think what resonated with me most is the ways in which these masculine norms result in a dearth of relationships, a dearth of connection. And as you talk about, we talk on the podcast all the time these days about the importance of connection and how boys are really being robbed of that because they don't have the model. And actually, the day that I listened to the episode, my son, who's about the same age as yours, he's 10, he came home and he said, "Mommy, I just love school so much." And I said, "You do? Why do you think that is?" Because he didn't always love school. And he said, "I just feel like I have so many friends." And I had been listening to the episode and just thought, okay, good. Like, what can I do to really facilitate this so he maintains these connections? Because I look at my husband, who's middle-aged, and he really doesn't have a lot of connections. And in fact, he had a good friend and they had like this text relationship, like a group text, a couple of the guys. And the whole thing was just giving each other a hard time. Like, you know what I mean? Like ribbing each other and making fun of each other. And, he said to me, like, "I love these guys, but like, this just isn't what I want in a relationship." But like, he doesn't really have a model for how do I get the kind of male relationships that I want. And then that's being modeled to our son. So I just found this really helpful as a way for any of us who have boys and men in our lives that we love to really think about how we can be behaving differently so that we're not even inadvertently promoting these really unhealthy masculine norms.
And I think also consistent with the mission of our podcast is the idea of really regarding every human as sharing the same fundamental needs and ways to live a fulfilled life. And it just really struck me how boys and men are not getting that in many ways. And the data is bearing it out. I mean, there's an article every day right now about less men going to college, less employment. There's just a lot of data backing up this men getting left behind idea. Now, I just want to quickly point out the tension. That this is not picking men over women or picking boys over girls as, well, their needs are more important. This is really expanding the space to consider what is happening with our social and cultural norms to everyone. We don't have to pick.
100%. There don't have to be sides. We can fight the patriarchy and we can work hard to get greater equality for women in pay and in every other way. And we can also meet the needs of boys and men simultaneously. And that, the research shows that patriarchy is bad for men and women. Like the more we do better across the board, the more everyone does better.
Exactly.
And I love the quote that you share from an article that Ruth wrote recently in the New York Times, in terms of helping fix this problem of the impossibility of masculinity. And I think one thing people can do is to share this episode with anyone who has boys and men in their lives that they love.
Which is everyone.
Is everyone.
So share the episode with everyone. Thank you. All right. I hope all listeners get as much out of this as Jill and I did. So I am here today to talk with Ruth Whippman, who has a recent book out that has caused quite a stir, I will say, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. And her book is Boy Mom, Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity. Ruth Whippman is an author, journalist, and cultural critic, and the mother of 3 boys. A former BBC documentary director, she has written for the New York Times, Time Magazine, The Guardian, HuffPost, and other publications. She's also the author of the book America the Anxious, which was a New York Post Best Book of the Year and a New York Times Editor's Choice and Paperback Row pick. Ruth, thank you for being here today on Psychologists Off the Clock.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you.
So we actually have a lot in common. We both have 3 kids. We are also both self-proclaimed feminists raised by mothers who forbade Barbie. And
I love meeting my people on the Barbie thing.
And also, she did not want me to wear dresses. So, of course, that's all I wanted to wear.
Oh, same.
But the difference here is I started my motherhood with 2 daughters. And then my third born is my one and only son. And so, to be honest, the topic of masculinity in boys really hasn't been at the top of my mom worry list, and I have quite a big list.
Yeah.
I will say one of the joys of reading is when the way you think really gets challenged. And after reading your book, I am very concerned about masculinity and how it's going to affect my son and how it is affecting my son. So I think I've probably ignored some uncomfortable truths about raising my son because I just didn't know what to do with it. But in Boy Mom, you give us really powerful context and reasoning for not ignoring how we're treating boys, men, and masculinity. And in fact, I noticed the use of impossible masculinity in your title.
Yes. So interestingly, the UK version of this book, it's toxic masculinity. And that wasn't my choice, but I chose impossible masculinity because I think what it sums up is just this sense of impossibility from all directions. So I think that in the one sense, there's this sort of old story of masculinity, which is kind of impossible, which is like, be strong, be a hero, be invulnerable, squash your emotions, don't show weakness, don't show flaws, which is impossible by definition for any human to achieve that. Nobody can be flawless and superhuman and invulnerable. That's not possible. And it's really damaging to boys and men's mental health to sort of aspire to that as an ideal. So that's impossible, but in that sense, and that's an old story. But then I think in this particular cultural moment where, post Me Too, and in the years where we've been doing this kind of reckoning around men and male harm and toxic masculinity, I think there's a sense of impossibility coming from the other side that boys are really experiencing, which is like, there's this kind of micro generation of boys that were going through puberty when the Me Too movement really kicked off and exploded online. And they have spent their whole adolescence in the shadow of this conversation about toxic masculinity and being told, in various different ways culturally that they are inherently harmful, that it's time for them to shut up, let everybody else have a turn, that they mustn't take up too much space, that they have, so they're still being told to be aggressive and dominant and invulnerable and all the old things. And now they're being told that they have to be small and not take up space and to be quiet and let everybody else have a turn and not to be all of these things. And I think the result is that for this generation of boys, it's an absolutely unique an impossible experience. They don't know how to be. They don't know where to go. They don't know how to give this conversation context. And, so I think I wanted, with that phrase, impossible masculinity, I just wanted to convey a sense of impossibility from all directions.
And that's essentially the entire book, gets into the nitty gritty of it. But that is the take home, that what's happening in this cultural moment is an impossible situation for boys in terms of their identity development and social emotional development. I really enjoyed and appreciated how personal and vulnerable you are in the book with your motherhood journey. And you start the book pregnant with your third boy. And that happens to also be 2017 when the Me Too movement is really picking up steam. So could you talk a little bit about that time for you? Because I found it really powerful.
Yeah, so I had 2 boys already. They were 7 and 4 at that point. And I was very heavily pregnant with a 3rd boy. And it was just this extremely loaded time to be a mother of 3 sons. I was lying there, 8.5 months pregnant, feeling pretty sick and pretty neurotic in that way that, pregnancy can do to you. And, Weinstein was exposed. And then, it was the Trump presidency. We were a year into that. The president himself was talking about, I don't know what kind of language I can use on this show, but, we all know the kind of language that the president was talking about, or was using. There was, and after Weinstein was exposed, it was just like one after another, these like stories of terrible men. And I think as a feminist, I was very conflicted. It was this moment where, the feminist part of me was really overjoyed that this conversation was finally out in the open, that we were exposing these men. And I think most women felt this sense of recognition. We had felt this sense of powerlessness for so long. And suddenly we had this voice. We'd been mocked and belittled and we'd been abused and we'd been silenced for so long. And suddenly women had this like clarity and this voice and, and it felt really exhilarating. But at the same time, I'm like, well, look, I'm raising these 3 sons. There's obviously something really wrong at a systemic level, that this kind of sexual violence, this kind of misogyny is so normalized in our culture. It wasn't just a few bad apples, it's everywhere. And so, I'm thinking, obviously we have these huge blind spots. I don't believe that anyone wants to raise a rapist or a sexual predator. Nobody's doing that intentionally. It obviously comes from these kind of huge blind spots in our culture about what we are normalizing for men and boys. And so it just suddenly felt like this huge pressure. I was scared of the task ahead. I felt defensive about my own boys. I felt angry at men and the patriarchy, but also at the same time sort of didn't want to think badly of the entire gender that included my own children. And it was very conflicted. And I'm very honest in the book about those feelings. I didn't want to oversimplify it. I think it's very easy to pick a side in this and be like, I'm on the side of girls and women, or I'm on the side of men. And I think that was what was happening in the cultural conversation. And I think I was in this I've been thrust into this quite unique position, being like, I have to think about the concerns of men and boys because I'm raising them. I couldn't ignore that. I have to see how this fits into what we're doing in this moment for girls and women. And it was a complicated time.
I think the way you articulate both just now and in the book is very relatable. And I think it helped me find somewhere to land too, because I think the default, especially having really strong values and beliefs about supporting and empowering girls and women.
Yes.
That's where so much of the focus has been, right? Yes. And
rightly so.
There's a reason.
There's a reason, yeah.
And I don't think you're saying, let's not do that anymore.
Absolutely not. I mean, I've devoted so much of my career and life and thought and energy to that cause, and I still passionately believe in it, empowering girls and women.
But I remember actually the very first boyfriend my oldest daughter had. And it was this. So anytime there's a first, there's more emotion to it for a parent, right? And I remember being so scared of like, what could happen? Is he going to make her do something that she's uncomfortable with? Like that was the first thing in my head. And then I had a moment of clarity where I looked at his young face and thought, he is someone's son, just like my son is mine. Yes. And I mean, not that we need to shirk responsibility. We need to talk about consent and all of that. But it's also to have this automatic assumption that he's going to harm her.
Yes.
It's also not.
Yeah. And I think it's a really tricky thing because obviously that assumption or fear comes from something very real that's happening in our culture. And, it's good that we're correcting for that. But I think for this generation of boys, they're growing up with this idea that they are inherently harmful and, that they're these kind of predators in waiting. And, the best we can do is just to sort of reduce the damage that they're going to cause. And I think psychologically for this generation of boys, it has been extremely damaging. and it has been extremely harmful. I don't think that it is healthy for any child to start off with that assumption. And these are not the people who did, this generation of boys are not the people who did all this harm. And yes, they're part of the same system, but we're talking about children here. And so I think we need to be really careful about conflating a lot of things. And every child deserves a fresh start. Every child deserves the benefit of the doubt. They deserve forgiveness. They deserve a warm climate from the important adults in their lives. They deserve the chance to make mistakes, to learn and grow. And I think because of the history of it, we put boys in this very, as I say, this impossible position.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So, let's actually go back to the beginning and talk about male infants. The way you pulled it all together just further enlightened me. So the science shows that we're actually really letting down our boys without realizing it from their first days, weeks, and months. So can you say more about that?
Yeah. So what's really interesting is there's these two kind of facts that are sort of pulling against each other. And I think they combine to make this real double whammy of harm for boys. So male infants at birth, their brains are less mature than female infants on average. So they are about a month to 6 weeks behind girls in terms of right brain development, which is the part of the brain that deals with emotions, self-regulation, attachment. So their brains are immature at birth, which means that they're more vulnerable to disruption. And there's lots and lots of data on this. This isn't a controversial thing that I've just made up. And we know that male infants are more vulnerable physically. They're more likely to get sick or die from pretty much every illness or disability. And this is also true in terms of emotional development too. So they're born very vulnerable. And a girl infant on average is more independent at birth. She's more resilient. She needs less from her caregivers. And a baby boy needs more support, more nurturing, more care from caregivers in those early weeks and really throughout childhood in terms of managing emotions, forming the attachment bond, etc. But because of our sort of views about who boys are and what they need, we kind of masculinize them right from birth. So we actually they need more care, but we actually end up giving them less nurture and care. So you see, there's all this research that shows that, we project these masculine qualities onto boys. We handle them differently. We jiggle them around. There's studies that show that, we throw them up in the air and we roughhouse with them, but we do a lot less of that kind of caretaking touch, that sort of emotional nurture. We talk to them less. Mothers talk to baby boys less than they talk to baby girls. And that continues all the way through childhood. We spend less time listening to boys' feelings. We spend less time engaging in emotional nurture. We spend less time reading with them. We spend less time on singing songs, on drawing. There's this huge raft of activities that people do more with girls, and they give them more of this this kind of tender nurture than they give to boys. So it's this double whammy. They need more, they get less. And bit by bit, this sort of adds up to this really big gap between boys and girls in terms of, their ability to form relationships and to empathize and all of those kind of more social emotional skills.
And I'm sure that this is still unconscious for parents.
Of course. Yeah. No parent thinks that they're treating. But, it's all the data around racial bias or around gender bias, so much of this stuff is subconscious. And, and often I think people are even doing it out of love. Some people are doing it completely unconsciously. And other times I think, and you hear this a lot with dads, it's they've been given this message about who a boy is and what they need, that they need to toughen up, that they need to be stronger, they need to be independent. It's not good for a boy to sort of express too much emotion, and there will be costs to them. And so I think, parents often do this in a loving way, that they think they're doing the right thing, or they're completely unaware of it.
And you pulled out a really interesting study and finding that the physical affection for children in the early years has been linked to healthy moral development.
Yeah. So it's really interesting because moral development is really linked to attachment and to early years care. And we know this, this again isn't controversial, but it's just we haven't yet thought about it in this gendered way, I don't think. And it's interesting that, I found this study from India, and, there's many problems with this narrative, but it's just as a sort of interesting aside that, I think we in the West take for granted that boys are going to be less emotionally intelligent than girls, in adolescence. We just sort of assume that's the case, and we assume it's natural. But a study that I found in India found that actually boys were more emotionally and socially developed in adolescence than girls. And this probably is likely, and their researchers sort of attributed this to the fact that boys in India get all this early years nurture and care that girls don't get. This is not a good thing. This probably shows a lot about neglect of girls in those societies and all the rest of it. But I think that it just shows that these things are not inevitable,
Right. Exactly. So another huge eye-opener for me, and again, I feel like I know this, but I didn't really know this to the extent that you get into it. And I'm going to call it the Babysitter's Club effect.
Yes.
And that is how children's media portrays friendships for girls versus boys. Yeah. So how is children's media letting down boys when it comes to social and emotional development?
So this hit me. The first time this really hit me was I was in the bookstore with my 3 boys after school. They were quite little, elementary age. And we were sort of looking at books and stuff. And there was this magazine, and it was so clearly, I saw it on the shelf. It was so clearly like targeted at girls. It was like pink sparkly cover and like the friendship bracelet giveaway and all of this. So I looked inside the magazine, and the first story was this story about a girl who had been invited to these 2 birthday parties that were scheduled for the same time. And she was really worried she was going to like disappoint one of the friends by not going to her party. So she came up with this scheme that she would like run between the 2 parties and pretend that she was like fully at each one, and like sneak out the back and run to the other one, and, do the games at one and the cake at the other. And I realized as I was reading this that my boys will never see a story like that with a boy as the main character. They will never read a story where a boy is like worried about disappointing his friends and running between 2 birthday parties and doing that kind of emotional labor. And those kinds of stories are absolutely standard for girls. Like every story, the Netflix algorithm, the books, the library section, they all serve up this like very steady diet of girls' friendships and these friendship dilemmas where the whole narrative is about how do you manage other people's emotions? How do you manage your own emotions? How do you think about other people? How do you take care of people? And boys their stories don't have those in them. And I think that at this point, many women I know of my sort of age feel exhausted by the amount of emotional labor that we have to do men in our lives. And it's too much. And I think there's a narrative in feminism that we should all just like give up on this. But I think what we're not seeing is like the other side of it, which is like doing that kind of emotional work and tracking other people's feelings and seeing what they need. These are the skills that are absolutely at the heart of having a connected, emotional, social life. If you don't learn those kinds of skills, you cannot be deeply connected to another human being. And I think down the line, we're seeing all these men who are just profoundly lonely. They don't have these deep friendships. So I think for boys, it's like a combination of what we do teach them and what we don't teach them. It's like we're failing to teach them and to scaffold those like social emotional skills and narratives and to give them role models to see themselves in those kinds of roles. And we're giving them all these messages about, their stories are all, fighting and battles, competition. It's a hero. It's a villain. Someone's covered in glory and the other person gets killed, and that is how humans interact in their narrative world. And it's bit by bit, again, we're building this story about who they need to be in the world and what has nothing to do with them,
I will never forget when I first walked my son and a friend to school, early elementary, after having 2 daughters and walking them to school for years. And I was flabbergasted by the one-upmanship happening.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what is this? It's like, well, I did this and I did this. And it's like this kind of boasting and bragging and showing off that I just did not see with my daughters.
Yeah. And I think that's completely normalized for them, that human interaction is essentially like competitive rather than cooperative. And it's, they get that message from everywhere all the time. Yep. And once you have this sort of lens on it, you see it everywhere. As soon as I noticed this phenomenon, I saw it everywhere. And so I interviewed a lot of older boys for this book, about their lives and, what their concerns were. And I remember this one boy who was describing how his friendships were so competitive and how debilitating that was for him. Like, he said he wanted to get support from his friends, but he felt he couldn't because then he'd be losing in the race that they were, and it was really tragic. I think it hadn't occurred to him until he was older, but then he was so stuck in these kinds of patterns. And several of the boys described those kinds of friendships as being really unsatisfying, actually. It was like when they had the sort of maturity to see it for what it was, they really craved the kind of support that girls and women get from their friends, but they just had no idea how to go about,
Well, and getting back to the emotional labor piece and women being like, we have too much emotional labor, right? But this is where men end up getting the social and emotional support because of how their friendships are culturally normed to be not that. But so then the only people they get it from are the women.
Other women. So and you see this pattern over again, that they look to female friends or girlfriends or their moms to provide that kind of support. But I think, that if they're not able to do it for each other, then, we're always going to be, the burden is always going to be on girls and women to carry that load. And we don't want to carry that load. We want emotionally healthy men. And I think it's easy to be kind of angry with men and boys over this. And I know that I have been at many points, like, why is this all me? But also, I feel really sad for them. I wrote this line in the book, which was, under patriarchy, boys and men get everything except the thing that's most worth having, which is human connection, and that they really lose out on that. And, when we're all lying on our deathbeds, I don't think that we'll be thinking, I wish we had more power in our lives. I wish I'd had more, a better career. We'll all be thinking, that the most important things are human relationships and those connections. And boys and men are really losing out on those.
On this podcast, that, we're psychologists, mental health, right? This is what we talk about all the time. And that is the repeated theme over and over, is the central role of connection for psychological health. Masculinity is robbing boys and men of that connection.
It really is. I mean, there's ways in which masculinity sort of helps build connection in quite a superficial way. So it's this like buddy backslapping and the sports teams and all of that. So, not knocking that, and I think boys and men do build real bonds through masculine type activities. But I think it's sort of quite surface level often, and they just, the norms of masculinity and the stories that we tell boys and the things that we fail to teach them mean that it's so hard for them to access those deeper, more emotional connections.
Yeah, that they are complex emotional beings with emotional needs that deserve to be met.
Yeah, I saw this great reel online where it was a dad actually who was talking about it, where, and I write about this in the book as well, where it's like people were always saying to me, boys are like dogs. This was like a refrain. So it was like, boys are like dogs. All they need is food and exercise. They're just these simple creatures. Just wear them out. And, girls are complex. Girls have emotions. Girls have all these needs. And this guy on this influencer was saying, actually that just kind of normalizes a kind of neglect. It's just like, oh, they don't need anything. Of course they need these things. They need them more. They need more emotional engagement. And it's really sad. You look at the research, and parents and adults in general are so much more willing to engage in emotional conversations with girls. And it starts from birth. You see the way that mothers and fathers chat to newborn babies, and they will use different vocabularies. They will listen to feelings more. And we don't do that with boys. And then we normalize this idea of like disconnecting them from their emotional selves, suppressing their emotional selves. And by the time they get to adulthood, they're so disconnected from their own emotions. They can't even name their emotions. They don't even know what they're feeling, let alone, express it to somebody else or feel safe to express it to somebody else.
Let's talk really specifically about masculinity.
Yeah.
And you kind of get into this idea of scripts of masculinity.
Yeah.
What would you describe as the current scripts? You've sort of referred to them, but you can elaborate.
It's interesting because I think, the old school sort of model for masculinity was this like provider protector role. And it was, family man, that sort of, go out and earn the money. And I think over time we've developed this much more, and I think there's economic reasons for this, why that model is no longer the sort of the main one. Women are earning money, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the model now has become this almost cartoonish, like action hero, hand-to-hand combat, like fantasy manhood kind of idea where it's, you see it in the CGI superheroes, this hyper-muscled. You see it in the masculinity influencers online that our boys are all exposed to. It's this, it's a body type, it's an invulnerability, it's this cartoonish, it's weapons, it's violence, it's fighting, it's aggression. Yeah. And I think it's become even more like those elements were always present in the sort of masculine ideal, but I think they've become the top note and the like provider protector model has become the bottom note. I think there's problems with the provider protector model, to be clear as well, but I think that, this new sort of action hero model comes with, superheroes, invulnerable.
Yeah.
I think that comes with real problems. And you see it, in its most extreme form. With school shooters, you read these sort of manifestos written by school shooters, and you can see that they are so influenced by this idea of masculinity and their own feelings of emasculation and inadequacy in the face of it.
You quote men's mental health researcher Matt Engler-Carson as saying, masculinity is a precarious social state.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting idea. So precarious masculinity. So masculinity is something, it's never like a settled question. Boys and men have to constantly prove it and reprove it in pretty much every interaction. And once you see it in that light, you can see this happening all the time. The way that boys and men behave when they're together, it's about being secure and being tough and being invulnerable and being all of these things. And I think boys and men are so worried about this idea of losing their masculinity. It can be taken away at any time. And as another group of researchers described it as hard fought, easily lost. You can lose that status. So I think boys and men live in this kind of state of anxiety about it, that they could be knocked down at any moment, that they could lose, they could lose that masculine status. And I think the boys that I interviewed felt very anxious about that in different ways.
Yeah, I will say that your coverage of very specific people that you connected with while writing this book was really fascinating. You really get into their inner emotional lives, and it really portrays the struggle that I think we need to be paying attention to.
And what was really moving to me about doing that research, so I interviewed around probably 50 boys for this book, some in more depth than others, but and what was really moving to me about talking to these guys, I had expected, when I thought, I got to go and talk to teenage boys, that they wouldn't want to talk. They would just be like monosyllabic. But what I found was they were desperate to talk. They felt that nobody was listening. They hadn't had anybody actually curious and non-judgmental about their experience. They'd had a lot of people lecturing them about how toxic they were and all the rest of it. But they didn't have many non-judgmental adults that they could just tell this stuff to and relate their own experiences without fear of being censored or, in either way, either that you're not manly enough and you're a pussy and you're a wuss, or in the sense of like, you're a rapist, you're a predator, you're a mansplainer, you're taking up too much space. In that sense either. And they wanted to talk and talk and talk and talk. And, I would like schedule an hour and we would be talking for 2 or 3 hours often, and it was very moving to me how much they had to say and how articulate they were and how much they wanted to share their feelings.
Well, it's interesting. We had another episode 361 called Dudes and Dads with Danny Singley. And they got into what you get into in your book as well, which is that in 2019, the APA, the American Psychological Association, issued guidelines for therapists working with men and boys because traditional masculine ideology, and this is in quotes, as marked by stoicism, competitiveness, dominance, and aggression, is a risk. to boys' physical and mental well-being. So it's a concern. It's a public health issue. We're talking about public health issues right now with parental stress and everything, but we need to be talking about boys and men.
Right. And there's this real problem because I think there is this male mental health crisis happening at the moment, which is very invisible. Mm-hmm. And, we see that there's like a lot of research that's been done on this, that there's this like underreporting of male depression, like, both like in terms of boys and men, like going and seeking help. And also in terms of the surveys and studies that they do, when the survey taker asks boys and men, how are you doing? They could be like deeply depressed, but they will likely say, I'm fine. So it gets marked down as, oh, boys and men are doing fine and girls are really struggling with their mental health. But it's a really distorted picture. And we know that the male suicide rate is about 4 times the female suicide rate. And it's part of this is just that boys and men do not seek help until it's way too late. And this is a tragedy and it's a public health emergency.
Well, one thing that I thought was interesting to pull in is you have a chapter titled Hyperconnection and Disconnection, Boys Online. Such a good chapter title because there's so much in there. But as you say, masculinity can often be the enemy of deep connection. And I think that's where this then ties into these mental health risks, right? And this is how masculinity is tying into the general mental health picture for boys and men these days. And my understanding is, I think it's middle-aged men have had the largest increase in significant mental health problems.
Yes.
And we're not really talking about it.
We're not talking about it, and they're not talking about it either, for the exact same reason why they're suffering from the mental health problems in the first place, which is they haven't been given the vocabulary to talk about their emotions. They haven't been given the social permission to do that. They have been prevented from seeking help, and so it's not normalized for them. And so there are really wonderful men in this space who are doing really great work in the sort of male mental health space, but it's still really invisible, in our culture. And it's really tragic.
Well, and we talk so much about girls' vulnerability on social media and the mental health risks of being online for girls. I mean,
yes,
we're always 10 to 14 girls are the highest risk. But you actually talk about how boys and girls are interacting with their phones and screens differently, especially around connection.
Yeah. So what's really interesting is that if you look at the research, that girls online interact in a sort of broadly similar way to how girls interact in real life, which is they provide support, they get very deep with other people. And then the flip side of that is that there can be some sort of cyberbullying and some, but it's all very, very connected and human. And I think what the trend is with, boys is it's all about disconnection. It's all about replacing real life socializing with online socializing. And in the male kind of social spaces, which are generally video games, large video games, and forums like Discord or Reddit, it's a way to kind of avoid talking about things rather than to promote it.
I actually have been very aware of my 10-year-old son loving Fortnite.
Yeah.
Like money. And he does spend time with his friends that way. But it's sort of like gradually become a replacement and for the in-person time. And I'm realizing it. And so this past weekend, his friend who he wanted to play Fortnite with had too much screen time for the day. So I'm loving when families have good limits too. And so they said, but how about he just comes over and they actually hang out? And so I, first of all, was very pleased that he was on board with it and not fighting for more Fortnite time. Yeah. So he went to his friend's house for 3 hours and he came back in the best mood. I mean, it was just like, I think that is something intentional we can do as parents.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Carve out that in-person time.
Absolutely. And it's a sort of social muscle that really needs to be built. And, and for all the reasons we've talked about, that social muscle is not as developed in boys as it is in girls. How to be with another person and interacting and, sharing experiences. We teach girls the ways to navigate that, and we don't really teach it to boys. So I've found, like, with my own boys, quite often they'll have kids over and it'll be like, can we have screen time? Can we have screen time? And it's kind of really excruciating because it's like they don't know what to do apart from that. They don't know how to interact. They don't know how to be together apart from on screens. I feel like I have to push through my own discomfort about it. I feel like, oh God, if I don't give them the screens, then they won't have anything to do and people won't want to come over and kids won't want to be with them. But it's like, if I can manage my own discomfort and just push through it, then they actually do find ways to play and interact and be together that are not screens.
The other thing I found really fascinating related to this is the face-to-face time that if you compare teenage boys with teenage girls, when you remove sports, so that's an important caveat, the average teen boy spends 42 minutes a week in face-to-face versus 6 hours for girls.
Absolutely. There is a really, really big difference. So this phenomenon that people call it displacement, which is this idea that you displace, real life social time with screen time. And this problem of displacement is significantly worse for boys than it is for girls. And this is something that I think hasn't been talked about enough. So girls are still socializing in person much more than boys are. And so it's quite a gendered problem. And I think that just the whole discussion around screen time and social media and girls' mental health is really missing this piece.
Yeah. Because we will move on to incels, which is sort of the extreme negative consequence. I really had a passing knowledge about incels before reading your book, and this was a really hard chapter to read. Can you define an incel and why it's important to talk about this when we're discussing masculinity?
Yeah, so it was a really hard chapter to write as well. I'll say that. But so an incel stands for involuntary celibate. So it's this group of young men, often adolescent boys to kind of young men, who are hyper online, and they, involuntary celibate means that they can't get a girlfriend. They are very lonely. They don't have sex. They want to be with, they typically would desperately love to be with a woman, and they can't find one, or nobody wants to be with them. They generally identify themselves as being unattractive, ugly, failures in the kind of system of masculinity. So they have this whole philosophy about, there's these chads, they call them, who are like the kind of alpha males, and then there's like the beta males, and at the bottom of the hierarchy are the incels. They often are extremely misogynistic, they are racist, they are anti-Semitic, like all of the horrible things that exist, in the most toxic parts of the internet, you will find on incel forums. And they're hideous online spaces in many, many ways. And at its fringes, this movement has also been associated with acts of violence. So their kind of incel heroes is this guy called Elliot Rodger, who committed one of these terrible mass shootings in Santa Barbara.
That was the Santa Barbara, the sorority house, right? So it was against women who reject, right?
Right. It was either the actual women who specifically reject, but this idea of women, it was just, I don't think these were the actual women that had rejected him, but they were the type of women that he wanted to be with, but he, the general type of women who did reject him. And he shot a bunch of them and then shot himself. And it was horrifying. And there have been other examples of sort of school shooters who are either specifically associated with the incel movement or very adjacent to that kind of movement, that type of profile of young man. And I was really horrified and interested in this group because they seem to be the very, very extreme manifestation of some of the more general trends that we were seeing in boy culture. This is the absolute far off conclusion. And, I have my own anxieties about it as a mom, and I wanted to understand these boys, these young men, and to just, there has been real pushback in feminist communities about engaging with these guys, very understandably, because their views are extremely toxic. and this idea that if we kind of humanize them or empathize with them, then we will be like normalizing this behavior, giving them a platform, all the rest of it. But my view was that I really wanted to hear from them, because I think if we don't understand what leads a person to that place, what the pain is, what the pathway is, if we don't engage with them on a human level, we will never be able to understand or prevent people going down that path. If we just say, these people are beyond the pale, we can't help them, just
write them off,
then, and we see, we've seen it with these tragedies, these recent school shootings where boys, we know this profile. We've seen this guy a million times. Every time you hear the news of a school shooting, when you see the picture of the guy, who this person is going to be. Mm-hmm. And there's usually this tragic story, and this kid who's been, desperate for help, desperately needs help, unable to access it, and gets further and further marginalized down this path of like horror. So I wanted to just really understand and talk to these guys. I ended up I talked to more than appear in the book, but in the book I focus on these two guys who are associated with the incel movement. One of them who is actually this sort of very sweet and not misogynistic person at all, who just kind of got caught up in it. And the other one who was really challenged me. He was deeply misogynistic. His views were abhorrent. He was sort of repellent to me in many ways. But once I started like really digging in and trying to understand, you can see these pathways of pain. You can see all the same phenomena, all these pressures of masculinity to be this like alpha male, to be this tough guy, to be the, and how it's impacting them, and how the shame they feel when they fall short, and the profound loneliness that we've talked about, and how it all comes together. And they find the really sort of surprising thing to me was actually the way that these guys found belonging and connection in these forums. So forums were this really weird mix of like horrible misogyny and toxic behavior, but also this like male vulnerability and tenderness and brotherhood that men cannot access in other places,
Right.
And that was this paradox that just horrified and fascinated me, And it was almost like, because these guys felt that they were such failures in the system of masculinity, that they'd almost like given up, and they didn't even need to bother to like prove their manhood anymore. So it gave them this like permission to be vulnerable and to connect and to speak emotionally with other men in a way that was not possible for them in real life. So there were all these complex paradoxes happening.
Well, bravo to you. But you do talk about this masculine discrepancy stress.
Yeah.
Right?
That is, researchers, and there's research published by the CDC and all of that uses this measure. So they call it masculine discrepancy stress. And what they argue is that it's not masculinity itself that makes men violent. It's this shame from feeling not masculine enough. So if a man feels that he falls short of the standard expected of him for being a man, and the more stressed he is by that, the more likely he is to be violent in all these different ways. So domestic violence, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, assault with a weapon, all of these things. It's about shame. It's about proving manhood in these toxic ways. And once you know that, it kind of rings true. Sometimes research, you're like, oh, yes, I know this. Instinctively, it makes sense. And I think this is what these incels were feeling, this like gap between what was expected of them and how they saw themselves. And, I describe it as this mix of kind of entitlement and inadequacy. So on the one hand, they believe that like this very toxic messages that we give to boys, where it's like, you're entitled to women's bodies, you're entitled to glory, you're entitled to be a hero. And also this kind of inadequacy, these pressures, like you have to be this, you have to be invulnerable, you have to be flawed. And the combination together just is so chillingly toxic. They believe that they are owed this, and they're going to go and get it, and they feel terrible about themselves that they haven't got it. And then together that kind of curdles into something extremely problematic. And they often felt that they just couldn't get help. The one guy that I spoke to, he really wanted help. He wanted to see a therapist. He couldn't afford it, for one thing, but also he felt like he was scared that if he went to see a therapist, the therapist would be like, well, men are so privileged. What are your problems anyway? And, and he really felt that. And although obviously no therapist is going to say that, it's not crazy that he would feel that people would shut him down in that way, because many people do, you know?
And you acknowledge there's two powerful influences. You say, for every right-wing tough guy urging his crying son to man up, there is a voice from the left telling him that to voice his problems is to take emotional airtime away from a woman whose suffering is more valid. So that kind of just coalesces the inherent tension.
Yeah. And I think, you know, a lot of us on the left, and you know, it comes from a good place in the sense that we want to give a voice to more marginalized people. But I think it's like, on the one hand, we say to boys and men, you know, express your emotions, you know, but then when they do, we kind of mock them for it and we shut them down.
So Ruth, what do we do about this? How do we change masculinity to better care for boys and men? And is that even the right question?
So I prefer not saying how do we change masculinity, but like, let's stop talking about masculinity altogether. Because I think the more we say this type of masculinity or that type of masculinity, the more we're like reinforcing masculinity is the be all and end all for boys and male worth. So I think, you know, let's talk about these qualities as human qualities that we all need. You know, we all need toughness and strength and endurance and agency and courage, the sort of masculine associated qualities. We all need nurture and care and relationships and intimacy. And those are the feminine associated qualities. And in a way, let's take the gender labels off of those. Those are human qualities. But I think for boys in particular, I tend to kind of split it into these three categories. I think for me, they fall under the headings of like critical thinking, curiosity, and care and compassion. So the critical thinking piece, I think, is just like for us to have these conversations and to be aware of these moments, to spot, like, I think we have so many blind spots. And like you were saying, and like I experienced myself, where we don't notice the way that we don't give boys friendship stories, the way that we normalize, you know, these stories of aggression, the way that we don't teach them these skills, the way that we don't give them the kind of care as babies that we give to girls. So critical thinking around that. And I think we've done a good job of that with girls, actually. You know, if I think about what was normal when I was a kid, the kind of sexist BS that people could say, and it was totally normal. And now even like 5th grade, 6th grade girls could call that out in a heartbeat. You know, they could say this is sexist. And I think boys don't have that vocabulary and they don't have those critical thinking skills to call it out, and nor do adults. So I think that's the first step, the critical thinking. The second is the curiosity. I think we need to listen to boys, you know, and really listen, you know, not just lecture them and you have to be this and you're toxic and you're this and you're that. It's like, what is your experience? You know, tell me how you feel, and really show an interest in what they actually say, not the feelings that we kind of want them to have, but like the real ones. And then the care and compassion is just to sort of reorient our relationship with our own sons and with boys, to see them as these emotionally complex creatures who need care and empathy and allyship and, you know, and all of those things. Yes, we've devoted a lot of resources to boys and men in the past, and that's very real, but kind of the wrong resources.
Right.
You know?
Right. You bring up a really striking comparison, which is we do not talk about femininity.
Right. I mean, this is the thing. Like, imagine if every time we were talking about, you know, busting stereotypes for girls or expanding roles, or, you know, a program for girls in STEM or a program for girls in science or a program for girls in sports. And if we called that healthy femininity or positive femininity, we would know, we'd be like, oh God, you know, this is such like reductive sexist BS. And maybe that kind of was the way that people talked in, you know, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, but not now. And so I think if we constantly talk about positive masculinity, healthy masculinity, we're still reinforcing that they have to be masculine.
So I actually read your article that just came out in the New York Times about positive masculinity, right? And you say, all humans, regardless of gender, have the capacity and the need for toughness and fallibility, gentleness and emotionality, wild courage, and tender nurture. If we really want to help boys break free and find more expansive and healthier ways to show up in the world, it's not positive masculinity that they need, but full humanity. We need to change the use of these ideas and constructs. And, you know, I do think there's some hope with the whole construct of gender, right?
There's a lot of change, and it's wonderful and it's exciting. And the newer generation are thinking about these things in different and exciting ways. I think the risk of it can sometimes be that, that sort of male identified children who still identify as boys, cis boys, kind of get left behind in those conversations often. It's like everybody else is expanding their notions of gender and breaking down stereotypes. And I think it's almost like we've vacated the category of cis boyhood and just like, there's no room for expansion within that category. You have to almost like step outside of it if you want to behave differently. And, that's an oversimplification, but I think it's a risk. So I want that same sense of possibility and expansiveness when we're talking about boys and cis boys, as we have for everybody else. And that's why when we talk about positive masculinity, we're still like reinforcing that old stereotype. And I think we'll look back on that in the future and be like, that was a good first step, but it's not, we can
need
do
more.
better. We need more.
Right. Well, Ruth, like I said, this is one of these books that I will talk about and think about for a really long time. It really was like this paradigm shifting reading experience for me. So thank you for your work on this book. And I am positive that our listeners would get a lot out of it. Thank you so much for coming to Psychologists Off the Clock. Where can people find you?
So my website is ruthwhipman.com. I also write a Substack called I Blame Society. So you can find me on Substack there. And the book is called Boy Mom, Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity.
Great. Thank you so much, Ruth.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.